Hello and welcome to our webinar, Use of the MMPI-3 Comparison Groups. We would like to welcome our presenter today, Dr. Joseph Ben-Poreth. Dr. Ben-Poreth is a professor of psychological sciences at Kent State University and a board-certified clinical psychologist. He received his doctoral training at the University of Minnesota and has been involved extensively in MMPI research for the past 38 years. Dr. Ben-Poreth is a co-developer of the MMPI-3, MMPI-2RF, and MMPI-ARF, and co-author of numerous test manuals, books, book chapters, and articles on the MMPI instruments. He has served as editor-in-chief in the journals Psychological Assessment and Assessment, and as a member of APA's Committee on Psychological Tests and Assessment. Dr. Ben-Poreth's clinical practice involves supervision of assessments at Kent State's Psychological Clinic and consultation to agencies that screen candidates for public safety positions. He also provides consultation and expert witness services in forensic cases. We are extremely pleased to have him here today to share his expertise with us.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and good day, and welcome everyone to our webinar on using the MMPI-3 comparison groups. Before turning to the substance of the presentation, I would like to offer a disclosure of my financial interest in the instrument I'll be discussing today. I am a paid consultant to the MMPI publisher, the University of Minnesota Press, and I receive research funding from the University of Minnesota Press as well. And as co-author of the MMPI-2RF and MMPI-3, I receive royalties on sales of test materials and scorings. With that, here's our agenda for today. I'm going to begin with a little bit of background about the concept of comparison groups and the historical evolution of our comparison groups that are available for use with the now with the MMPI-3. And then we'll go over the currently available comparison groups that are embedded in the scoring software for the MMPI-3 and Pearson's Q Global and Q Local platforms. We'll then go over some case examples of using comparison groups to help guide the interpretation of test scores. And we will have time left at the end for questions and answers. So I do want to encourage people attending. If you have questions along the way, type them into the Q&A box. I will not be monitoring the box during the presentation, but Ben Clares from Pearson will join us at the end, and he'll go over the questions that and I will answer as many of them as we can get to during the presentation. So that's our agenda, and we'll turn to our brief background. So comparison groups were first introduced with the publication of the MMPI-2RF in 2008, and they were intended and still are to complement information that is provided from the test norms themselves. So the norms indicate, of course, our standard scores tell us the test taker's standing on any given scale in reference to the general population, that is the general adult population of the United States, if we're using the U.S. norms in the U.S. So the T-score that is derived based on the norm tells us where the individual score falls in reference to our general population normative sample. Comparison group data provide information about the individual standing on each scale in reference to other individuals tested either in a similar setting, say mental health outpatients, or under similar circumstances, for example, a pre-employment evaluation. So they complement the information from the norms. They don't replace the test norms, but they give us that added perspective, and we'll see some illustrations of when and how that added perspective can be very helpful in providing complementary information. This is the list of the original comparison groups that were available when the MMPI-2RF was first released in 2008, where the list, any of these lists that we'll be looking at, say men and women, that means that we had separate comparison groups for men and for women, including the MMPI-2RF normative sample. And that allowed us to compare test takers' results with either just the men or the women of the normative sample. Beginning with the MMPI-2RF, we no longer use gender-based norms. So all of the T-scores that are available are based on a combined gender, or what we call non-gendered normative sample. But if a test user was interested in comparing the individual scores with just the men or just the women of the normative sample, that could be accomplished with the comparison groups. And then we had other comparison groups representing mental health, outpatient and inpatient settings, substance abuse treatment settings, pre-surgical candidates, bariatric surgery, some forensic samples in the initial release of the MMPI-2RF, and 2 personnel screening samples, one for law enforcement or police candidates, one for correctional officer candidates. Now, you can see here that these are combined gender comparison groups for the personnel screening. And the reason for that is that there are some legal prohibitions on using gender-based norms in employment-related testing. So anytime we have norms that are to be used in a pre-employment evaluation, those are always going to be combined gender comparison group data that are available. One of the things that we did with the MMPI-2RF, and will continue to do, and you'll see are doing, in fact, with the MMPI-3, is that we're regularly updating our comparison groups. So in red here are highlighted the groups that were added over the years to the MMPI-2RF comparison group list. Some additional medical settings, additional forensic settings were represented in added comparison groups, as well as some additional personnel screening settings or occupations. And so this was the final list of comparison groups that was available when the MMPI-2RF was last updated as far as comparison groups are concerned. Now, the plan for development of the MMPI-3, of course, included collecting new comparison group data. And we had to collect new data because we have new items on the MMPI-3 that were not part of any previous version of the instrument. So it's not possible. With the MMPI-2RF, we were able to rely on older MMPI-2 data sets because all of the MMPI-2RF items were embedded within the MMPI-2. But given that we've added 72 new items to the MMPI-3, obviously this required collecting new data in part for the purpose of creating new comparison groups. So part of the development plan was collection of field data to be collected at sites representing settings where the MMPI is used, including traditional mental health settings, medical, forensic, and public safety settings. And some of these data were used for scale development, some were used for validation purposes, but we also plan to use these data for the purpose of creating comparison groups for the MMPI-3. At the conclusion of the data collection process before the test was released in 2020, we had collected comparison group data from, field data from over 16,000 individuals. And this was our list of comparison groups that were available when the MMPI-3 was released in 2020, in the fall of 2020. Very similar to the list that was originally available for the MMPI-2RF when it was first released, again, for the normative sample, separate comparison groups for the men and the women, outpatient community mental health, also a private practice outpatient sample, a medical setting pre-surgical evaluation sample, some forensic data, prison inmates, personnel screening. So again, very similar to what we had when the MMPI-2RF was first released. And of course, with the MMPI-3, unlike the MMPI-2RF, we have separate norms for the Spanish language version of the test. And so we also have separate comparison group data for the men and women of the Spanish language normative sample. And that, of course, is only to be used if you're administering the MMPI-3 in Spanish. As was the case for the MMPI-2RF, we've continued to collect and add to the scoring software comparison group data. This is our current list of available comparison groups. So it's grown quite a bit in these 3.5 years. I have some color coding here representing different points in time in which these data were added. The ones in red have already been added within the last year and a half or two. And then the ones in orange are the most recent additions to the scoring software that you can, Q Global, where you can use the have access to all the currently available comparison group data. A couple of things I wanted to point out here. You'll note that in red, we've added for most of our comparison groups, in addition to the male and female comparison group, combined gender data. And the reason we did this was in order to allow use of comparison groups with individuals who are non-binary, do not identify with either as either men or women, which was necessary, of course, in order to use either the male or female comparison group data. So it is now possible to use comparison group, a combined gender comparison group of individuals who identify as men or women and are not required to identify one as one binary gender or the other. And so that's available for almost all of our comparison groups. We've added most recently a VA outpatient mental health sample. At this point, we only have a sufficient number of men, but we will be adding women. And at that point, we'll be able to also create a combined gender comparison group. We've also recently added a comparison group of collegiate athletes, which is different from our general college student comparison groups. Two new forensic comparison groups, child custody litigants. So these are individuals who completed the MMPI-3 as part of a child custody evaluation, and parental fitness evaluees. So these are individuals who either have lost custody of their child to the state because of concerns regarding the welfare of the child and are seeking to regain custody, or are being evaluated in the context of an evaluation where they may lose custody to the state of their children. We have a couple of new personnel screening comparison groups, airline pilot candidates and clergy candidates. And the final two groups listed here are intended for use outside of the United States, in Australia and New Zealand. Martin Selbaum led the collection of a community comparison group that allows a comparison. That the norms are still going to be based, the T-scores that is, are still based on the U.S. Normative sample, but this provides the context of how a test taker in Australia or New Zealand score compare not just with the U.S. normative sample, but also with a community sample collected in one of those two countries. And we have also added, since the release of the MMPI-3 for the Spanish language version, a sample of parental fitness evaluees who were tested in Spanish in Puerto Rico. At this point, we have sufficient numbers for a female and combined gender comparison group. We'll be adding men, and we're interested in adding, of course, additional Spanish language comparison group data as well. So that's our current list, and what we're going to do next is take a look at some of, not all, we don't have time to look at all of these comparison groups, but get a sense of what these comparison groups look like, and how we might use this information in an assessment. We're going to begin by looking at the men and women of the MMPI-3 normative sample. The combined gender sample is 1,620 individuals, an equal number of men and women. And what we see plotted here are their scores, their T-scores. And of course, for the normative sample, we're going to see means that are right around 50 and standard deviations that are right around 10, that they're not going to be exactly equal to 50 or 10 because of possible gender differences. And indeed, this does allow us to look and see whether there are any meaningful gender differences among the men and women of the normative samples. And typically the standard that's used to identify a clinically meaningful difference is at least a 5 T-score point difference, and you're going to see that by and large, the means are much closer than that for the men and women of the normative sample. We're looking here at, skipped a little too fast here, the higher order and restructured clinical scales. Again, we see some differences that don't rise to the level of a clinically meaningful difference. These are the somatic, cognitive, and the internalizing scales of the MMPI-3. And the only difference that we see where we do get greater than 5 T-score point difference between men and women in the normative sample is the normative men scoring 6 points higher than the normative women. The mean is 6 points higher for the men, and this is a fairly consistent finding across many of our comparison groups, with that men score higher than women on the Sci-Fi disconstraint scale. Turning next to one of our mental health samples. So this is a sample of individuals tested at intake for treatment at a community mental health outpatient community mental health center. And of course, and you can see the numbers here, the minimal number of individuals to create a comparison group is 200. So we need to have at least 200 valid protocols to create a comparison group for the MMPI-3. You can see that for our community mental health center outpatient sample, we have 233 men to 356 women. And of course, when contrasted with the normative sample that we were just looking at, the first thing that we notice is that we have much higher scores on some of the over-reporting scales, the F scale, FS, and RBS, with the women scoring a little bit higher than the men on some, but not all of our over-reporting scales. Now, the thing, of course, that we need to be mindful of here is that these over-reporting scales are not pure measures of over-reporting. Scores can also be impacted by the presence of psychopathology. That's something that's embedded in the interpretive guidelines for the over-reporting scales. And indeed, we would expect a mental health sample to score above 50 on these over-reporting scales, because again, they are to some extent also sensitive to the presence of genuine psychopathology. And so this, if we're looking, for example, at the F scale score of a mental health outpatient, and it's in this range of 60, 70, or say 80 and to 85, it's within about a standard deviation. That's what this is telling us, that it would be within about a standard deviation of, my slides are skipping faster than I wanted them to. Here, we're back. Within a standard deviation for this population. So it's not an uncommon finding, whereas if the T-score is in the 90s, that's well outside the range that we find even for a typical mental health outpatient. So turning to the substantive scales, what we see here is that not unexpectedly, in an outpatient mental health center, the highest score among the higher order scales is on the emotional internalizing dysfunction scale, indicating that that's what we're going to see more commonly in terms of psychopathology, is problems related to mood and affect in this particular mental health setting. And we see indeed elevations, also clinically elevated mean scores on the 3 RC scales, demoralization, RC2, and RC7 for women that are related to difficulties in the domains of mood and affect. And if we turn to the somatic, cognitive, and the internalizing scales, we can see, again, elevations in particular on cognitive complaints and anxiety-related experiences for this sample. Now, if someone scores at the clinically elevated range on anxiety-related experiences, we don't ignore that, because it's a fairly common finding in this setting. But we can see to what extent the level of anxiety is consistent with what we typically see in mental health outpatients, or if the T-score is well above 80, that would tell us that it's outside the range of the typical levels of anxiety that we encounter in test takers in a mental health, in this particular mental health outpatient setting. On the externalizing scales, we don't see any particular patterns of note for this population, and similarly for the interpersonal scales. And again, we can see fairly close scores on most of the scales for the men and the women in the comparison groups. And then here we have the Psi-5 scales with clinically elevated scores on the two scales associated with features of cluster C personality disorders among the Psi-5 scales. Okay, turning, and one other point I did want to make is, again, we're seeing that men score higher than women on the disconstraint scale in this mental health outpatient sample. So now for a very different type of population and assessment, police candidates. So now we're looking at a sample of individuals who are assessed in the context of a pre-employment evaluation. This is obviously not a clinical population. In fact, it's a pre-selected population, because before an individual can be referred to a psychologist for a pre-employment evaluation of suitability, psychological suitability, they already have to have a conditional offer of employment in hand. So all of the background checks, all of the initial screening that's done that doesn't focus on potential mental health issues has already happened. Person passed all those hurdles and now is being referred to the psychologist for a pre-employment evaluation. And so this is a large sample, just over 2,000 police candidates, equal number of men and women. It's combined gender. In all of our combined gender samples, we have an equal number of men and women. And of course, the validity scales look very different from what we just saw for a mental health outpatient sample, again, giving us the added information of the context of the evaluation. So we see very low scores on the inconsistency scales, CRIN and VRIN. People who take the tests in the context of a pre-employment evaluation tend to be very cautious, deliberate in their approach to the test, and are less likely to contradict themselves, which is what we see reflected in elevated scores on the inconsistency scales. And where, of course, we do see some elevations is on the underreporting scales, which is to be expected. If someone is taking the test in the context of a pre-employment evaluation, of course, they're going to try to present themselves in a relatively favorable manner. They may be admonished, not before the testing, you shouldn't do it right before giving the test, but at the beginning of an evaluation, that it's important that they respond honestly and provide a good reflection of how they're doing. But the reality is that individuals do attempt to portray themselves in a favorable manner, at least to some extent. But the other thing that we see reflected here, and this is particularly true with the mean T-score of 65 on the K scale, are some of the confounds associated with the underreporting scales. In the case of the overreporting scales, it's genuine psychopathology that could, to some extent, produce higher scores. In the case of the K scale, it's actually good psychological adjustment, because test takers who produce an elevated score on K are basically describing themselves as better adjusted than average. Now, given all the pre-selection that I just described that happens before these individuals are actually tested, to some extent, this above average score on K reflects better than average psychological adjustment rather than underreporting. And so we can see for a sample of police candidates, this is the range within which we would expect to find their scores on K. If the score falls outside that range, now we have something that is unexpected and needs to be better understood in the context of a pre-employment evaluation. And we'll see some examples of that in just a little bit. The other thing I wanted to point to here are the very small standard deviations on most of these scales. Remember, for the normative sample, the standard deviation would be 10. And here we see much smaller standard deviation values. That's reflected in these plus or minus 1 standard deviation bars that are in the graphs here. So there's less variability, more consistency within the sample in the way that these individuals are responding. On the substantive scales, we're seeing means that are considered on most of the scales considerably below average. Again, that's to be expected both because of the highly pre-selected sample of individuals who are referred from pre-employment evaluations and the effort to portray themselves in a positive manner. So we're seeing low means and again, smaller than the general population standard deviation. So for example, if we look at the higher order emotional internalizing dysfunction scale, a mean of 37, standard deviation of 5 means that a T-score of 47 falls below the general population mean, but 2 standard deviations above the mean score for police candidates. So again, that's the added perspective that we get from the comparison group here. Similar findings for the somatic, cognitive, and the internalizing scales, with one important exception here. This is the new compulsivity scale. And what we're seeing here is that our police candidates have a mean that's fairly close to the general population mean of 50 and a standard deviation that's fairly close to the general population standard deviation of 8. And again, that's important because what you will see then is that in reference to other scales, scores tend to be higher on compulsivity. We don't want to be misled by that. That doesn't mean that this is someone who, with a T-score of 47 on the compulsivity scale, who is compulsive and rigid in their approach to problem solving. It's just that's the normative level that we would expect to find in police candidates on this scale. Okay, looking at the externalizing and the interpersonal scales, the 2 scales that I wanted to point out here are self-importance and dominance. Again, these are not clinically elevated scores. They're right at the general population mean of close to the mean of 50, but they tend to be higher among police candidates than other scales are for this population. And you don't want to be misled by that into concluding that potentially in itself is an indication of problems in that domain. Psi-5 scales, nothing to point out here. So we'll move on to the next set of slides, what I've done here is added to our 2,036 police candidates, a sample of 536 correctional officer candidates, 256 dispatcher candidates, and 220 firefighters candidates. Again, equal number of men and women in each of these samples. So comparing these various pre-employment public safety comparison groups, and what we see is a lot of similarity across the 4 groups. The only scale on which we're seeing a little bit of differentiation is the uncommon virtues, or the L scale, with the correctional officer scoring the highest and the dispatchers scoring the lowest on this scale. But other than that, as we go through these slides, you can see by and large, remarkable consistency in both the means and the standard deviations. Here we can see that all 4 of these samples score higher on compulsivity than they do on most of the other scales. And that's also true on, again, the interpersonal scales that I mentioned earlier, self-importance and dominance scale scores are right at the general population mean of right about the mean of 50, and here we see the Psi-5 scales. This is one of our new samples that we've just added, airline pilot candidates. These are all individuals who were tested as part of a pre-employment evaluation for a North American air carrier. So we would expect them to look fairly similar to our other pre-employment samples, the public safety samples, and for the most part, they do. We, again, see low scores on the inconsistency scale, so they took the test very seriously and made an effort not to contradict themselves. K is elevated at 62, but unlike the public safety candidates, they score actually a little bit lower on L. So that's one difference from the other pre-employment samples that we were just looking at. Turning to, and the other thing I wanted to mention is we are again seeing here relatively small standard deviation, so not much variability among the airline pilot candidates, as we saw for the other pre-employment samples. Looking at the substantive scales, again, we're going to see that the scores are considerably below the general population mean of 50. Standard deviations are smaller than 10. And looking at the specific problem scales, same phenomenon that we saw with the public safety candidates. Compulsivity mean score right around 50, standard deviation 10. So again, this is not clinically elevated. It's not an indication of problems. It's just that we need to expect and realize that on this particular scale, a mean score of 50 or a score of 50 is consistent with the comparison group, whereas for other comparison groups, that would be above the comparison group. A t-score of 50 would be in some instances well above the comparison group mean of 50. Here we see some other scales where we get scores that are closer to the general population mean for the airline pilot candidates: activation, self-importance, and dominance. These two we saw for the other pre-employment samples as well, and nothing particularly noteworthy here for the Sci-5 scales. Turning to another of our recent additions to the comparison groups, child custody litigants. So these are individuals who were assessed in the context of child custody evaluation. They're involved in litigation, partners who are involved, or spouses who are in the process of getting divorced or already have been divorced, and there's some problems or questions related to, sorry about the interruption, child custody. And specifically, what is the best child custody arrangement for the children that there is a dispute here between the parents, and the role of the evaluators to inform and provide recommendations to the court, which will ultimately decide the custodial arrangement that is in the best interest of the child. So we have 266 men and 253 women in our child custody comparison group. We also have a combined gender comparison group for child custody litigants as well. You can see that their scores on the inconsistency scales are a little bit below average, but not as much as we saw for the pre-employment samples. And as we would expect, we do see above average scores on the underreporting scales. Obviously, the stakes in child custody litigation are quite high. And these are individuals who are also similarly motivated to present themselves as relatively well-adjusted in order to obtain a favorable outcome of the child custody evaluation. So this gives us an indication of the level of elevation that we would typically find in child custody litigants, and any deviation from this would represent a relatively unexpected finding in a child custody litigant that we would try to understand as part of the interpretation. Here are the scores on the substantive scales, the higher order, and the restructured clinical scales, and nothing in particular stands out here, except that, as you can see, they're higher than what we saw in personnel screening, and there's also more variability. Not quite as much as we see in the general population, but quite a bit more variability in scores in child custody litigants than we see in pre-employment evaluees, and a mean score at the general population mean of 50 on the RC6 scale. With older versions of the MMPI, particularly the original MMPI and the MMPI-2, we typically found above average scores on clinical scale 6, the old paranoia scale. We're seeing the mean score on RC6 is right at the general population mean. It's higher than the means for many of the other scales, but it's not an indication of that this population in general shows difficulties or potential problems in that domain. Specific problem scales, somatic cognitive and internalizing, some are around the 50 range, some below. a little bit less variability than the general population. Here we see the externalizing and the interpersonal scales and the Psi-5 scales with that T-score difference between men and women also found among our child custody litigants. Next, we have our sample of disability claimants. So now a very different set of demand characteristics, a very different population. These are all individuals who are assessed in the context of having filed either a disability claim or in some cases personal injury litigation. As we might expect, where we're going to see higher scores in this population is on the over-reporting scales. These are higher than what we saw in our mental health outpatient sample because in addition to being a population, disability claimants that has a higher prevalence rate of psychopathology than the general population, there is, of course, also potentially the incentive to over-report. This sample does not include none of our comparison groups include any invalid protocols. So these are all people who scored below the invalidity rate for over-reporting, but we are seeing higher levels of scores and more variability, standard deviation of 16 and 15 for the men and women on the F scale of the MMPI-3. In terms of the substantive scales, we're seeing elevations on scales that we might expect to see in disability claimants, the emotional higher order emotional internalizing dysfunction scale, RCD, RC1, somatic complaints, and RC2, elevations on cognitive complaints and anxiety-related experiences. This is the scale of the MMPI-3 that's most sensitive to features of PTSD. About a quarter of the individuals in this sample were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Externalizing interpersonal scales, nothing in particular to emphasize here, and the Psi-5 scales with elevations on negative emotionality and the introversion low positive emotions scale. All right, we're going to look at the next at what the reports, for those who are not familiar, the software-based reports from Pearson look like when you include the comparison group, which is always an option. So the open diamond represents the mean. The shaded bars represent plus or minus 1 standard deviation from the mean. The solid line connects the actual test taker's score on the scale in question. So this is a test taker with a T-score of 39 on the CRIN, Combined Response Inconsistency scale. And then the final row of numbers here is the most important and informative of all in some ways. This is the percent of individuals scoring at or below the test taker on the percentage of individuals in the comparison group scoring at or below the test taker. So we can see that in this example, the test taker's T-score of 39 falls at the 4% level. These numbers are not exactly percentiles, but they can be interpreted as the same as percentiles. So basically a T-score of 39 on CRIN falls at the 4th percentile for an outpatient community mental health male in this case, in this illustration. We do include some item level information that I'm not going to be focusing on in the examples, and the item content and numbers have actually been redacted here from the slide, and all of that is to maintain the security of the test items. So because this webinar will be available in general for training purposes, we've omitted the item content, and I won't be focusing on item level information, but just to point out that in the item level information sections of the score report or the interpretive report, you do get information about the percentage of individuals both in the normative sample and in the comparison group who answered any item that's listed in the critical responses, so in this case, this particular item on the suicidal death ideation scale 22% of the normative sample responded true to this item, and 43.3% of the comparison group of mental health outpatient men responded true to this particular item. Okay, so let's turn to our case examples before opening things up for Q&A. The first example we're going to look at is a 19-year-old woman who was tested in a college counseling clinic as part of the intake process. And looking at her MMPI-3, of course, we're using the college counseling clinic comparison group. And in this case, we're using the combined gender comparison group. And we can see that her scores fall pretty much within one standard deviation from the mean on, and very close to the mean on all of the validity scales. So nothing really stands out as far as her test taking approach is concerned. But when we turn to the substantive scales, we see that there is a significant elevation, clinically significant elevation above the cutoff of 65 on RC9, and that this is a rather unusual finding in a college counseling setting. She's at the 97th percentile for individuals tested at intake to a college counseling clinic in this case. Turning to her specific problem scales, we can see an elevation on cognitive complaints, and again, that this falls outside the standard rate at the outer edge, but on the other side of that edge, and at the 90th percentile in terms of her cognitive complaints. She reaches the ceiling. This hash mark represents the highest possible T-score on a scale. So she's at the ceiling on an efficacy, which of course means that the percent scoring at or below is always by definition going to be 100 once you get to the highest possible T-score. On a scale, we see that on self-doubt, she's clinically elevated. She's at the 80th percentile for college counseling clinic, someone tested in this setting. And then we also see some elevations at the ceiling on impulsivity, well outside the range, and activation as well. And relatively low scores on self-importance and dominance for this test taker. Turning to a child custody litigant, 33-year-old woman involved in a child custody evaluation. We can see her scores here. The one thing that stands out is that she scores a little below average on the underreporting scales at the 40th and 34th percentile, still within a standard deviation, not anything I would make a whole lot of in the interpretation. And we can see that she is elevated on RC2, clinically elevated, and that this is a rather uncommon finding among child custody litigant women in this particular illustration. She also scores very low on RC9, and that's at the 14th percentile. So low positive emotionality, anhedonia, low energy at levels that are uncommon among child custody litigants. She's at the clinically elevated cutoff of 65 on self-doubt. Uncommon, again, we can see the extent to which it's uncommon in a child custody litigant. And everything else is pretty much within normal limits in this case, with the exception of the Psi-5 introversion low positive emotionality scale, which is associated with some features of cluster C personality disorders. The next example is a 44-year-old man. And here, in contrast to the previous example, we see very high scores on the underreporting scales. We can see just how uncommon those scores are. So we know that there's some very prominent underreporting that is likely to suppress scores on the substantive scales, and we cannot interpret the absence of elevation on the substantive scales as a reflection of good psychological adjustment or the absence of problems. In spite of that test-taking approach, the T-score on RC4 is quite high for a male child custody litigant and approaching the clinically elevated range. Nothing noteworthy with the internalizing or somatic cognitive scales. Clinically elevated score on juvenile conduct problems, approaching clinical significance on self-importance, and again, not a common finding for male child custody litigants. and above and outside of the range for male child custody litigants on the disconstraint scale. Next example is a police candidate, a 23-year-old police candidate assessed a male in the context of a pre-employment evaluation. And what we can see here are low scores, relatively low, not compared to the general population. This person's right at the general population mean, but we can see that a T-score of 53 on K falls well outside the range for pre-employment assessment of police candidates and is at the 10th percentile. So that's a very uncommon finding. This police candidate presented himself as less well-adjusted than most police candidates do, considerably less well-adjusted than most police candidates. And as a result, it's perhaps not surprising that we do get some significant elevations on at least some of the substantive scales, most notably RC9 at a T-score of 76. We can see falls well, of course, outside the expected range for police candidates, and the percent scoring at or below the test taker is 100. So no police candidate scores higher than this individual. None of the 2,000 individuals in this comparison group scored higher than this person did on RC9. Obviously, that will require some very significant follow-up in the integration of information from all the sources available in this assessment. That was the most noteworthy finding among the RC scales. Also elevation on the activation scale at the clinically elevated range, which will also, of course, require some follow-up, and nothing in particular on the Psi-5 scales. Next, we're going to look at an airline pilot candidate, a 30-year-old woman, and we can see that on most of the validity scales, she's pretty much at the mean and certainly well within a standard deviation. This below average score is not going to be meaningful on the FBS scale in this case. And so we turn then to her scores on the substantive scales. And again, she's pretty much tracking where we typically find airline pilot candidates on most of these scales. You can see here, again, that little blip on compulsivity, which if we didn't have the comparison group, we might think, well, maybe there's something going on here, but that's typical for this population and the other pre-employment samples that we looked at earlier. Nothing in particular on our externalizing or the interpersonal scales or the Psi-5 in this case. Now here's another airline pilot candidate. This is a 31-year-old man. And here we are seeing a lower score on K, so less of a presentation of good psychological adjustment, also some inconsistency, which is uncommon, so maybe didn't pay quite as much attention as he should have in this case. Now, again, we're using combined gender comparison groups for all of our pre-employment cases because we are not allowed to use gender-based norms in pre-employment evaluations. And if we go to the internalizing specific problem scales, we can see elevation on behavior restricting fears. We see a score on compulsivity that at this level, at a T-score of 69, falls at the 96th percentile. So we're certainly not going to say, well, that's common or within the range that we typically see in airline pilot candidates. So tendency to be compulsive, rigid, over-controlled, proclivities towards worry and rumination, and general fearfulness that obviously are issues that would need to be considered in this candidate's psychological evaluation. Okay, two more examples. This is a disability claimant who was non-binary, so we use the combined gender comparison group for this disability claimant. We can see that this individual scores within the typical range on the over-reporting scales, a little bit above average for disability claimants on the uncommon virtues L scale, elevations on RCD and RC2, that kind of pattern of scores that we sometimes see in individuals. Certainly, we would need to follow up here and determine whether this is someone who meets diagnostic criteria for a depression-related disorder would be indicated in this case. Inefficacy, stress, worry, also elevated outside the range that we typically see in a disability claimant, particularly high scores on disaffiliativeness, social avoidance, and shyness. These tend to be more dispositional traits that would not be attributable to whatever led to the disability evaluation, and this person obviously is quite high on those traits. And then finally, a bariatric surgery candidate, 51-year-old woman who was assessed in the context of a pre-surgical evaluation. In this case, we see that her scores are pretty much within normal limits and fairly close to the typical or prototypical bariatric surgery candidate. And so the findings here would be that we do not see, with the exception, and this could be an important one, of a higher score on the impulsivity scale, non-planfulness, poor impulse control, which would potentially be something that we would want to alert the bariatric surgery team as far as planning is concerned, either any kind of pre-surgical intervention or planning for post surgery. This could be important to take into account. And it is an uncommon finding in a bariatric surgery candidate. And these were the Psi-5 scores. So to summarize some key points, comparison groups can help refine MMPI-3 interpretation in the way that I've discussed and illustrated here. But it's important to note that they're not necessary. They're can be helpful additional information, but the interpretive guidelines, the clinical interpretive report, do not rely on comparison group data. So you can interpret a protocol without comparison group data for those populations or assessments where we have comparison group data. They can provide additional information. And now the other point I wanted to make, and I alluded to it earlier, is that if a comparison group scores on average in the clinically elevated range, that does not mean that for the individual who scores in that range, that's not a problem. It still would indicate a potential problem. For example, a T-score, the mean T-score for community mental health outpatients on the suicidal death ideation scale, 58 for men, 59 for women. Well, a T-score of 58 is clinically interpretable on the suicidal death ideation scale. So the fact that this is relatively common in mental health outpatients, that is suicidal ideation, would at this level would not mean that we don't take it any less seriously than obviously we should and do. You can create custom comparison groups. We call them user-defined comparison groups for settings or populations where comparison groups are not available using Pearson's software. There's information in the user's guide on how to do that. We have setting-specific interpretive reports. At this point, the police and public safety interpretive reports that do take comparison group data into account. The clinical interpretive report does not. And we will be adding some additional setting-specific interpretive reports. The next one that's scheduled for release is for spine surgery candidates that do interpret the comparison group findings as well, and more of those are in the works. Okay, so those are the points I wanted to go over, and we have a little bit of time left over for Q&A, so Ben, I'll just turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ben-Pora, for the great information and examples on the latest comparison groups. We did get several questions in, so I just want to let everyone know if we aren't able to get to them, we will try to follow up after the webinar and answer them as best we can. To start off, we're going to go to personal injury evaluations. This person asked, for personal injury evaluations, how well does the forensic disability claimant comparison group work? And disability claimants may not be representative of personal injury claimants.
Yeah, so as I think I mentioned that we do, in that disability claimant comparison group, we do have some individuals who are involved in a disability claim, but it was in the context of personal injury litigation. We don't have a separate for the MMPI-3 at this point, a separate sample of purely personal injury litigants. We did for the MMPI-2RF, and I can tell you that on the MMPI-2RF, the differences between the disability claimant comparison group and the personal injury comparison group were quite minimal. They were essentially inconsequential. The differences were the group scored very similarly. So based on that, I have a fair amount of confidence in saying that I think this disability claimant comparison group can be used with personal injury litigants. But that is one of the groups that we would like eventually to add to the MMPI-3. So if anyone attending today or watching this recording has access to those data, please do reach out to me, and I'll be very interested in working to put together a separate personal injury litigant comparison group.
Excellent, thank you. This next question, are there any circumstances that arise that would warrant a clinician relying solely on a comparison group sample?
I really can't think of any because, again, the interpretive guidelines for the test are not contingent on a comparison group. So if someone scores above the cutoff, which for most scales is 65, you don't want to ignore that just because the comparison group scores or doesn't score in that range. The comparison group provide additional information. They're particularly helpful when we're dealing with non-clinical samples such as pre-employment evaluations, because again, as we saw, the scores there can be quite different, and a T-score of 55 in that setting can be indicative, and we have literature showing with certainly police candidates with increased risk for difficulties later on the job. So I think they can always add information, but I would never look at them exclusively.
Excellent, thank you. We had a few separate questions come in about plans to add a fitness for duty comparison group, if one exists, or if there are any plans for that.
Yeah, you know, we've looked at that. We actually never had one of those for the MMPI-2RF either. The problem with fitness for duty, with creating a fitness for duty comparison group, is that the reasons why people may be referred for a fitness for duty evaluation are quite varied. And so the samples wind up being quite heterogeneous as a result. We may ultimately, and we're looking into it, we have reported some descriptive data for fitness for duty evaluees. It's really a clinical evaluation. When we're doing a fitness for duty evaluation, the question is, does this person have a mental condition that could impair their ability to perform their duties? So it's first and foremost a clinical evaluation of whether there is such a mental health condition in place. And then for those assessments, I think just going with the interpretive guidelines for general clinical interpretation of the test is the best approach.
Excellent, thank you. This next one, I have seen some very unusual test profiles on law enforcement applicants who have English as a second language and not just Spanish as their first. Clinical interview does not reveal any pathology. Do you have any suggestions on how to look at these profiles when ESL is an issue?
Assuming that the individual is sufficiently proficient in English to produce valid scores, and that their score, and I would pay particularly close attention to the inconsistency scales. If we're seeing elevations in someone like that on the inconsistency scales, then language may be an issue and an explanation. And if everything else looks fine, all the other sources, as just mentioned, are not raising any red flags, then I wouldn't be, I would be less concerned about what the MMPI-3 is indicating in that case. But if the consistency scales tell us that the person did respond relevantly and consistently, and we still get deviant scores or unexpected scores, I wouldn't ignore them. I would definitely look into them. But ultimately, the role of the evaluator is to integrate all of the information, including whether this person is a native English speaker, and reach their conclusions about suitability and based on all the available information.
Excellent. So I want to be aware of everyone's time, so I think I'm just going to do one more. And as I mentioned, we'll try to follow up with the rest of them after. This one comes in. Any comments on RC4 capturing behavioral, for example, juvenile conduct versus attitudinal callousness aspects of antisocial?
So RC4 is, of course, the name of the scale is antisocial behavior, and it very much focuses on behavior rather than attitudes. If you're wanting to look more at the attitudinal level, I think the cynicism scale is one that is particularly salient. But RC4 definitely taps into the behavioral component of antisocial tendencies.
Excellent. Well, thank you for taking your time today to present all this information and answer some questions. Anything else you had to say before we leave?
No, just thank you, Ben, and thanks everyone for attending today's training. And as Ben mentioned, if there are any follow-ups, feel free to reach out and we'll make sure to get back to you on them. And thank you all for being here.